All right, I've got two last quicker topics that I wanted to show. One is the Bean factory post-processor, and then we don't use Bean post-processors very much, but I don't think that I can mention a Bean factory post-processor without at least explaining the difference between the two. So the Bean factory post-processor allows you to take an action on a Bean definition, which is starkly different than the thing I'll talk about next. When you implement a Bean post-processor, you're implementing the Bean factory post-processor interface and marking it as a component, so it's in the Spring context. Now, there's several applications of this. One of our coolest, newest ones that we're working on, if you're in a distributed web service environment, you might have some pieces that maybe you're using OSGI and you're actually deploying some components together on the same hardware, and then some are remote across the network. I know we had this with our previous web service that we did a while ago. So you want to figure out, okay, do I make a REST call to go get this data, or can I just call it via Java? Obviously, the preferred is Java, especially when you get into a heavy used production environment. And so with this one, you actually you can get a list of the beans that you have available to you, what's been wired into the application context. And if you have two implementations, one's a remote and one's a local, you can make an educated decision about which way you should go. Where you'll see this most often is the property sources placeholder configurator. This is the, I've been switching back between 3.0 and 3.2 so much that the property, I think it's the property placeholder configurator is what it used to be called. But this is just a very convenient way to get properties. So I have a very simple demonstration of this. All right. So we want to get this mystery property. All right. So the endpoint is totally unrealistic, I understand. But what we do is we go, if we dig into the implementation of this endpoint, we find that in the service, it's just returning this attribute. And when we go to the attribute, we see that, oh, this is pulled from a property. Well, Spring by default gives you this property placeholder configurator, and it is itself a Bean factory. Bean factory post processor that swaps out this value with your system property value. And so I've got that registered in my properties. And now if I come to see if I can go out on a working demo, that'd be pretty cool. V1 mystery property, which is no longer a mystery. Here's the get. Here's V1. We'll see if it works. And it says it worked, so it worked. All right. Obviously, this isn't an example of a real application, but what that is your logic to load properties and use them more aptly. You don't have to do system.get property anymore, which is another beast to unit test, right? You have to mock out the environment, try and figure that out. You don't have to do that anymore because now that's all wrapped up in our service as just a attribute, which you likely have a getter or setter for, and it's really easy to mock. So testing is, obviously throughout the theme, is easy testable. We do a lot of unit testing, as much as possible. And we drank the Kool-Aid, I guess you could say. And so this is what all this stuff does. I see a question? Yeah.
I want to one additional advantage here is that if these properties are some environments, they're coming from properties now. With this, you don't have to know different.
Right.
And Spring just doesn't.
Thanks. And then there's one bit of configuration I did to make this happen. So we'll go to the Spring configuration, the Java configuration file I have. And here's just declaring a bean of type property sources placeholder configure. And then this is one way I did it for simple for demonstration purposes. You'll likely want a more elaborate, more robust property loading scheme, but it does the job. The other thing we do with bean factory post processors is I spoke briefly about endpoint tests. We have some endpoint tests that hit our database, but when we make calls up to kind of external web services, we don't want to hit those via when we're just running tests. And so we have a factory post processor that actually swaps out our stub implementations for our real implementations. Just another idea. And then the last thing, the bean post processor, just for contrast and oh, you know what? Yeah, well, I talked about this. This one, the biggest difference is bean post processors work on the actual bean instances as opposed to the factory, which is on bean definitions. And so a lot of people use these to wrap the beans in proxies if they need to. I didn't find any examples where we use it very heavily. If you, Ryan, if you recall any, let me know. But for anything, it's really easy to fat finger it like this when you're in factory post processor, so it's good to be aware of. But I did implement one just to demonstrate. And where I think it becomes clear. Okay. I have a very simple, this is going back to the factory post processor, just to show it running. So all I did here was implement bean factory post processor, mark it as component, and then I wanted to find out what beans I had in the system. Like I wanted to see, what beans does the Spring just put there by default, and then I want to see my own controllers and services in there. So I just looped through. I got beans for type, and I just threw an object, and then I looped through all of them and just print out the bean name. And now when I do that on startup, we will see a list of all of the beans that I had. So these are the definitions before they're instantiated. Now if you want to do something to an individual bean before or after it's instantiated, you can go to the bean post processor. I didn't want to litter my console with a whole bunch of outs, so I'll put these back. And now when I have a bean post processor that, all I did, there's two methods. There's process before initialization and process after initialization. And then when you implement one of these, it gets called after every bean that's instantiated, or before or after. And so here I'm showing that we're processing the post process before initialization method for this bean, and then immediately the after initialization method for the same bean. And it repeats that for every bean that we just saw. So it gives you an idea of when it's called. It's all startup time. What do you want to do at startup? Some other interesting ideas I just came to mind. I forgot what one of our teams does. The factory post processor is if you have a larger cache, say you're filling up a database upon application startup, that's a good time to kick that off. So if there's an large initial cost, so say the first web request to your application, that's a good place. Then no clients have to suffer that cost. So that's all I had to demo. There's a few things that I wanted to at least mention that we also use Spring for. One is we have a lot of aspects. For database transactions, we have our own aspects. For security, if in a REST-based world, if the user's not supposed to get to that resource, logging. Here's where it comes into play with if you have a stereotype for your repository layer, you can log every database call if you want. You don't have to because you'll have flexibility on what layer you want to do that. JDBC, here's a quick table that shows you what Spring does and then all that you have to do using Spring's JDBC stuff. straight from the Spring website. Yeah. I didn't dive into the security of this because I knew we would run out of time. But it's something maybe we can talk after. And the other really cool one is handler exception resolver. So I mentioned, oh, you know what? I didn't even show. If I was excited about this one too. All right. If you're down in the service and you don't find, I'm looking for a specific task. Oh, that's why, because my demo choked on this one. Otherwise, I would have shown you. If I'm looking for a specific task and I can't find it because it's not in the database, you send back HTTP 404. All I have to do is throw a task not found exception, and because it's annotated with response status, that status automatically gets propagated back. Now, there's probably exceptions in your application that won't have this response status annotation. That's what the handler exception resolver does. It helps you categorize what HTTP response codes and what to do with various exceptions. It's really, really powerful and deserves a lot of time itself, which is why I didn't go into detail. And then stuff that we're interested in that I just saw came out. One is Spring MVC Test. We have endpoint tests to test our controllers. Now, with MVC Test, you can test request mapping and all those annotations and all the aspects outside of the web context with a unit test. And that'll like our builds are long largely because of some of the tests we run. And that'll cut them down significantly. We're so excited about that. Embedded database support, just more native, a lot easier to get a SQL database up and running in Spring, that kind of stuff. For us, it's going to be really cool just for locally. If you're remote, everybody's going telecommuting, that kind of stuff. If you're passing a lot of data, setting up a lot of data in your database for your tests, it takes a long time to run those builds. And that's what we're seeing, so we're excited for that. REST template, just easier and more intuitive to consume REST services. Spring Batch, I mentioned it briefly with the JMX stuff. We run a lot of batch jobs if we need to fix data, et cetera. And so this Spring Batch should help us with that too. If there's any other questions, we have to take them. Otherwise, that's all I have for today. Okay.